Hi, everybody. This is Mr. Benninger. Given the current situation, we're going to try something a little different. If you notice, this says Industrial Revolution, and I know what you're thinking. Like, we already moved on from this. Why are we doing this again? We need to be take an SCA on this, so I want to make sure we were covered and that we covered everything thoroughly enough to where you're ready to take that. That will be this week. So if you're A group, that's going to be on Tuesday. If you're on B group, that's probably going to be on Friday. If you're a remote learner, well, get in touch with me. We'll figure out something. The Industrial Revolution, of course, is an important time period because a lot of things that we take advantage of today are that come from this time period, or at least started. The ideas started from them. Of course, one of the most important things we need to talk about, child labor, because that's really important. But anyway, so we're going to talk about the first Industrial Revolution, some things that come up in the second as well. But remember, Great Britain is the first country that sees these changes. And if you remember us talking about it in class, if you were here, the enclosure movement was a bunch of little farms being bought up by companies or by government entities and expanding them into much larger farms, plantation size. That's why I use that term. And so they keep getting bigger and bigger so they can produce things on a massive scale. Also, they can incorporate things like crop rotation to make sure that people don't, the ground doesn't get burnt out on certain nutrients, things like that. And so this is a major importance, but of course, this leads to a lot of people needing a job. We'll get to that in a minute. Another thing that Great Britain was really important for, was really the central hub for, natural resources, coal, oil, iron ore, access to a lot of water, so access to trade, things like that. So all these natural resources that are available were basically fed right into what was going on. And then you have some technology innovation, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So things like the steam engine being invented, spinning jenny, flying shuttle for the cotton industry, really propels things moving forward. So Britain becomes the central hub. You will need to know that. Other technological innovations, of course, James Watt, the steam engine. Henry Bessemer is who came up with the idea of puddling. That is where you cool a piece of steel really rapidly, allows the steam to escape quickly, and allows it to become a hardening process. Very important for obvious reasons. If you have brittle steel, it's not a good thing. Guglielmo Marconi, the invention of the radio during the second Industrial Revolution, very important for obvious reasons. We still listen, you can still listen to the radio today, but at this point, we're using it for communication aspects more than just jamming to your tunes in the shower. Okay. Alexander Graham Bell, the telephone. As well, of course, this is the hand crank. You're talking to a giant box. This is the smartphone that you have. But once again, being able to communicate across distances drastically changes the game. And then there's this aspect between Edison and Tesla, between what type of electricity becomes more important, the alternating current or the direct current. If we have time, we'll spend a lot of time specifically on this. Both inevitably become important, but one, there's an ongoing war between these two. And of course, Edison improves the light bulb, which drastically changes things. Paris becomes the city of lights. Shift work's able to go past nighttime. It drastically changes a lot of things. And so some of these inventions that we talked about, puddling steel, things like that, railroad, becomes important. The locomotive, steamboat, being able to travel. This allows people to be able to travel across distances as well as goods and services to be provided across distances. The factory, so you can mass produce things. Things become cheaper. And the internal combustion engine cars, planes, trains, all those sorts of things require that to work. So if you're driving a car right now, the internal combustion engine is probably why. Now, granted, that's been improved a lot since then. Working conditions. Remember we talked about while things were good economically for the top, the business owners, there's creation of a middle class, allowing businesses to be to grow. And if you're at the top of the business world, you're doing really well. The top 5% of people within these countries are controlling roughly 40% of the wealth. If you do the math, somebody's going to be not doing so well. And that, unfortunately, usually is your average factory worker. Factories are often loud, filled with pollution. You're dirty, you're grimy, it's not a safe working environment. There's a lot of damages, potential injuries, things like that. Women and children, of course, can be part of the workforce as well, but they are paid far less, especially children. Of course, children, we talked about in class, they can fit into machines relatively easily, which is a benefit for somebody trying to work on a machine, but it's of extreme danger to the child, obviously. So there are reports of injuries, things like that happening to children in these environments. Also, you have a lack of housing. You have too many workers in cities, not enough homes. So this leads to an overpopulation, people living in a house of maybe made for 4 people. You have like 15, 20 people in there. Lack of educational opportunities, lack of advancement, all sorts of terrible things going on. Disease runs rampant because of people being close together. Not sanitary conditions, access to septic systems, things like that, not readily available. You're working long hours, 12-hour shifts, give or take, and bad working conditions. You have harsh discipline if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And you could easily lose your job if you decide, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. The business owner's like, fine, see you later. I've got 20 people waiting in line to take your place. So though it was a bad condition and bad environment, the person needed that job and tended to put up with it. However, workers tend to try to fight back with the creation of labor unions to try to fight for fair working conditions. These still exist today. Things like United Steelworkers, the National Education Association, among other things. And there are pushes for what's called socialism. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Other advances in arts and sciences, you have a change from ornamentalism, so things looking fancy, to functionalism, which is things that are made to do the job. So we're not worried as much necessarily about the look of something. As far as literature, more natural to more symbolic. So we're taking something natural at its current state, and we might use it as a symbol to take care of something else. So this is where a lot of metaphors, things like that, starts playing a role. Similes, metaphors, all those wonderful things that English teachers love so much. Anyway, music. We talked about Romanticism, the idea that you have a lot more emotion in there. So instead of, you have a lot more expressionism, impressionism, chromaticism. So instead of just playing something to be complicated, you're playing something for a purpose to show meaning. So remember, Bach was somebody who played fugues, things like that were really complicated to show off how talented he was. And Beethoven starts dwelling into the Romantic period where you can start feeling things like frustration for him. Painting, realism. You have Gustave Courbet, who's looking at, like guys working in a field or something and painting that as it is, versus Eugene Delacroix, who's trying to capture emotion and things within. So Romanticism versus realism. And so there's different ways that this could look. Post-impressionism doesn't look real at all. It's kind of different. Yeah, a lot of blurry, like it's not clear. There's a lot of perhaps confusion in it, symbolism within it. Post-impressionism goes even further. Cubism, you're actually shaping everything into, as it sounds, cubes. Or then you have the abstract, things like Picasso, that are a lot more, don't look like the average everyday things that you see. So something to think about. Different ways of expressing the same thing. So physics, you have a change from Newton's mechanical universe, that watchmaker God view we call deism, to now Einstein comes up with the theory of relativity. And so that changes a great deal of things moving forward. It's basically it changes how we view gravity. It changes how we view time. It changes basically how we view everything through the theory of relativity. So, like, time is relative. You have special relativity, that's the absence of gravity. Different things. Not to get too complicated, I'll leave that to the science department. But the idea that God in a distance, now it's just things are relative to one another and how they interact with one another. In psychology, you believed at that point, before the ideas of Sigmund Freud, it was conscious awareness. Like, you knew what was going on in your mind, you knew about. And Sigmund Freud came up with the idea that no, there's an unconscious mind as well. The idea of your ego. Now, there's three forces playing against it: the id, the ego, and the superego. The superego is think of it's kind of like the angel on your shoulder, and the id would be kind of the devil on your shoulder, if you want to think of it that way. But basically, good and evil forces going on behind the scenes without you even realizing it, that could influence your decision making. So, really interesting. I'll leave that to if you take psychology later. But like we talked about, here's Stonebreakers by Gustave Courbet and Delacroix's Shipwreck of the Don Juan. So you can see kind of the choice difference. Courbet is just very straightforward, what's going on, where Delacroix looks a lot more dramatic. We already talked about Bach versus Beethoven, so I'll move on there. Charles Dickens versus Edgar Allan Poe. Dickens is a lot more realist as far as what's going on in society, trying to cause a change. Stories like Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, A Tale of Two Cities, things like that kind of show the social situation, where Edgar Allan Poe is trying to scare you. So very different. Then you have Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, which is kind of very straightforward, the heroic tale. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, kind of a lot more, it has romantic elements to it, but this is being experimented on, the idea of bringing somebody back to life. So it's taking like a real life thing and making it, showing what would happen if man played with nature. So it's a very interesting time period. You have a little bit of, between those two romanticism and realism forces playing against one another. And it drastically changes how we view those mediums. Then you have some scientific discoveries as well. Louis Pasteur, pasteurization of milk. You don't have to worry about getting a disease, hopefully, when you're drinking milk at that point. And the development of the vaccine, obviously front and center during this current situation. Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution, natural selection, adaptation. So remember we talked about the long neck giraffe versus the short neck giraffe. How over time that the short neck giraffe kind of became phased out because it wasn't the desirable trait. So natural selection, another term for that is survival of the fittest. That becomes a role in imperialism. And then, of course, the theory of evolution. that man potentially descended from ape, like Neanderthal, things like that. So Homo sapien came from something else. Marie Curie discovered radium, and this is a big deal under a microscope, by the way. They just walked up, hey, there's radium on the table. So we're doing this investigative discovery, and they see an atom for the first time. It changes how we view atomic structures. And why this is important is her discovery leads to inventions like the atomic bomb, or things by understanding that atomic structure, it allows us to create new things or understand atoms in a completely different way. It's very revolutionary. And then we already talked about Einstein's theory of relativity. Okay, so then we have socialism and communism coming to the forefront. So I just put this graphic on here. I thought it was a little simpler because people will just tell you, oh, communism is just extreme socialism. Not exactly. It kind of is. I'd agree with that to a point, but socialism, the main difference between the two is that socialism, you can get, if you contribute more, you can get more back in theory. Where communism, everybody has access to everything no matter how much you put in. So socialism, there's still an allowance for personal property, things like that, but the government controls a majority of the economy. Where communism, there is no private property, everything belongs to the government. Communism is more a political system, socialism is an economic system. Now it says it can work with a variety of systems, that's true. However, as we discussed in class, socialism kind of leaves the door open to a lot of other situations. Something to think about as 2020, we're hearing that term a lot more. So I thought this was an interesting quote down at the bottom, but we'll get into that another day. So, and Karl Marx, last guy we need to talk about. He was a historian who believed that history was driven through economic systems, and that basically the working class would rise up and overtake the business class. Okay, as he put it, the proletariat, the working class, would raise up and overtake what's called the bourgeoisie. Remember, we talked about that in the French Revolution, which is that business class, and that would drive history. So we went from hunter-gatherers to feudalism to capitalism, and so capitalism's main fault, according to him, was greed, and that people would become too greedy and hold too much at the top, and so eventually that working class will raise up. Everything will become equal through communism. That communism will solve everybody's problems, because the only way you can do that is equality. Now remember, we talked about the difference where capitalism believes in equality of opportunity, the idea that everybody has a similar chance to make it, but if you succeed and fail, that's on you, versus communism, which is equality of outcome. Everybody gets the same thing regardless of how much work you put in. So that's the distinct difference. That's why those two ideologies can't get along. That's why you see a lot of division between the two. And so we will spend a lot of time talking about that moving forward, because as world wars and things like that come up later on throughout this course, a lot of it is going to be on that idea of communism versus capitalism. So, all right. I hope that helped you. I'll put up a link for Kahoot. I'll put up a link for the notes we have used so far. And make sure you watch this, make sure you study, and I wish you the best of luck on your SCA. So I hope everything is going well, and I will see you in class.